She was born in the summer heat of Louisiana's Bayou country, where the air carried both the scent of magnolia and the rumble of oil pipelines threading through marshland. Her name was Amara Boudreau, and from her earliest days, she absorbed the rhythms of a place defined by both beauty and peril. Her mother, Simone, worked at a small diner on Main Street in Houma, serving orders of gumbo and po' boys to fishermen and refinery workers alike. Her father, Marcus, was a mechanic who repaired trucks that hauled barrels of crude oil to distant refineries. They lived in a modest trailer home on stilts a mile outside town, surrounded by cypress trees dripping Spanish moss and a network of leaking canals that fed the Gulf. As a child, Amara marveled at the marsh birds that nested in the reeds, the way the water beetles skimmed the surface in late afternoons, and the plaintive cry of ospreys wheeling overhead. By age 6, she could identify the plumes of toxic smoke drifting from the rig towers in the distance, a habit she would later reflect, born of necessity as her parents taught her to recognize danger. When she finished her peanut butter and jelly sandwich each morning, Simone would insist on applying sunscreen and insect repellent before sending her off to kindergarten at Houma Elementary. Even at that age, Amara noticed how some of her classmates sniffled beneath scrunched-up sweaters during recess, coughing when the breezes blew from the nearest junction of pipelines. She asked her teacher why her friends often wore blue surgical masks during oil smells, and was told it was just an unfortunate part of living down here. The teacher's shrug registered for Amara as a dismissal, an unsettling reminder that some dangers were simply accepted. She was 11 when her science class conducted a field trip to a local waterway known as Bayou du Large. Students boarded a small pontoon boat at dawn, and the guide pointed out patches of iridescent sheen on the water's surface, an oily rainbow reflecting on the still marsh. "That's petrochemical runoff," he told them. "Makes a pretty picture, but it's killing off the fish." Amara saw her friend Malik pick up a sample of muddy water in a plastic cup and swirl it. When he lifted the cup to his mouth, she cried out and swatted his hand away. He laughed, a brittle, mirthless sound, then scowled at her as he swished the water into a test tube. Amara clenched her fists, her heart pounding. She realized then that some children saw risk as an academic exercise, a puzzle to solve, but to her it felt existential and maybe political. She went home that evening and scribbled in her notebook, "Why does no one care if we drink poison?" In middle school, Amara excelled in science and English, but also felt an increasing dissonance between what she learned in textbooks and what she saw around her. In biology class, she dissected frogs and wrote lab reports explaining cellular processes. In social studies, she read about environmental legislation passed decades ago, like the Clean Water Act, and wondered why its promises did not seem to reach her bayou. During a literature unit on poetry, she translated the words of Langston Hughes and Mary Oliver into her own metaphors. "I want lungs that don't wheeze in the wind. I want water that doesn't taste like oil." She began to collect newspaper clippings about brown tides, Hurricane Katrina's lingering regressions, and stories of fisherfolk whose livelihoods had evaporated as marshlands vanished. Yet each time she raised her hand in class to ask why elected leaders did not seem to enforce the laws on paper, her teachers gave polite nods but offered no answers. "Let's focus on the curriculum," she was told. Those moments etched themselves into her memory, bite-sized injustices that aggregated into a fierce anger, an understanding that sometimes to be silenced was to be complicit. By high school, Amara's reputation as an outspoken truth-teller had blossomed. She founded an environmental club, Staunch Guardians, that met weekly in the school's musty media center. Dozens of students crowded around folding tables stacked with flyers about recycling drives, canned food fundraisers to raise money for water testing kits, and a petition urging the parish council to install more air quality monitors near the neighboring petrochemical plant. Her mother sewed banners for their booth at the school's annual spirit fair, bright blue and green panels proclaiming, "Protect our bayou, protect our future." Yet whenever they presented their petitions at City Hall, they were met with polite applause, but no action. Officials thanked them for their enthusiasm and promised to look into matter. But the next day, the haze returned over the bayou. The school resource officer whispered to Amara after one meeting, "Mind your parents' business, sweetheart. You've been given a platform here. Don't let it get you into trouble." Trouble found her anyway. In the spring of her junior year, a national advocacy group partnered with her club to organize a peaceful protest outside the largest refinery on the bayou. They marched after classes wearing T-shirts with the slogan, "Air that doesn't sting." Their signs, hand-lettered in her spidery handwriting, depicted oil derricks transfixed in wetlands. More than 100 students, parents, and teachers marched in line across Highway 90, extending from the school's parking lot to the refinery's gated entrance. When they reached the fence, Amara stepped forward and lifted her voice into a megaphone. "We demand that you implement better emission controls or shut down this plant." Cars slowed on the highway. Honks of solidarity echoed from trucks jockeying for position. But then the grown-ups drifted away. Local business owners who feared losing contracts, school administrators who feared district discipline, even some parents who feared the consequences. By the time a parish sheriff's deputy arrived to disperse the crowd, only Amara and 24 classmates remained. They refused to budge. The deputy, wearing dark sunglasses, approached her and said, "You have 15 minutes to leave before I cite you for trespassing." She replied, "We're on public right-of-way. We're not trespassing." He smirked and radioed for backup. Within half an hour, 20 uniformed officers surrounded them. They arrested Amara and her two closest friends, two Latinos, Rosa and Javier, handcuffed them and loaded them into separate patrol cars. News of the arrests went viral on social media, with pictures of teenage protesters in cuffs splashed across local news websites. That night, her parents ended up at the police station, facing harsh glares and hushed whispers from officers who remembered Marcus from his past trouble as a teen. When they finally found Amara in a cell, the overhead fluorescent lights gave her skin a sickly pallor. She hugged her mother tightly, tears smearing her eyes, and whispered, "We made them see us." Her mother, fierce and trembling, replied, "They'll learn to fear us soon enough." Within a week, the school convened a disciplinary hearing. Administrators pointedly noted Amara's repeated disruptions, her failure to follow instructions, and recommended her expulsion. They insisted that her activist activities fell outside the acceptable forms of student expression, especially when they involved blocking roads. Despite dozens of petitions signed by teachers praising her leadership and by peers attesting to her character, the school board upheld the recommendation, expelled for protest-related misconduct. On a crisp morning in April, Amara walked onto the campus one last time, carrying a cardboard box of personal items. Science fair trophies, journals full of half-formed theories, photos of her and her friends smiling beneath that homemade banner. Teachers stood in the hallways, some offering furtive smiles, some turning away. As she passed the locker clusters where she and her best friend Rosa used to trade climate factoids between classes, she felt her heart crack into 100 shards. She hugged Rosa goodbye, and they both cried silently before turning away. Expulsion meant that Amara spent the remainder of her junior year attending an alternative education program in a windowless room at the back of the parish library, sharing small desks with other discipline cases. There, she completed her coursework in isolation, but also found unexpected camaraderie among students with non-traditional paths, young mothers, juvenile offenders, and a few who, like her, had been punished for standing up. They shared stories late into the afternoons while she tutored them in biology and physics. Despite her anger at the injustice, she resolved to graduate on time, completing her required credits with determination. In the evenings, she worked at the diner where her mother had once waited tables, washing dishes and pacing the kitchen as she polished silverware, her mind alive with ideas for how to push back against a system that had silenced her. Throughout that summer, she stayed on the margins of the activism she loved. Whenever there was a rally against the newly approved pipeline expansion through the bayou, she could be found reciting statistics about sea level rise and corporate tax breaks, her hands trembling as she held the microphone. The parish council, though, refused to listen. Developers lauded the jobs the pipeline would bring, and many locals worried that opposing oil interests would mean losing their livelihoods. When she tried to challenge the parish president at a public forum, he dismissed her as a runaway high school student with no real credentials. That dismissal stung deeply, but also galvanized her. She realized that to change the narrative, she needed something more. Not just voice, but legitimacy. Not just passion, but a seat at the table where policy was made. So, as her 18th birthday approached, she meticulously charted her path. Apply to top universities with strong environmental policy programs, secure scholarships, cultivate mentorships, and, most critically, build a network of allies who would vouch for her expertise. In September, she began applying to colleges. She drafted essays about her protests, her expulsion, and her vision of a just future where communities like hers would not bear the brunt of environmental degradation. She pleaded her case to admissions officers, describing how she had turned adversity into resolve and why her lived experience gave her unique insight into environmental justice. She applied to Yale, Stanford, Harvard, the University of California's premier programs, and a few local schools. She reached out to environmental activists online, writers, policy analysts, scientists, and asked for letters of recommendation. Some responded graciously, sending glowing testimonies to her prospective colleges. By December, application deadlines approached. She sent in her transcripts, a summary of her community involvement, and a sealed copy of the expulsion letter framed as a testament to her willingness to fight for truth. Meanwhile, in Pine Hollow, local newspapers covered her story with a mixture of scorn and reluctant admiration. One headline read, "Local teen disrupts public order. Denied education." Another wrote, "Bayou activist expelled. Statewide attention follows." Social media churned with divided opinions. Some praised her bravery, others called her a troublemaker who flouted the rule of law. Despite the noise, she tried to keep moving forward. She spent late nights updating her resume and sending cold emails to professors whose work she admired. She researched scholarship programs offered by national environmental foundations and applied to internships at think tanks. In January, she learned of a Washington, D.C. fellowship run by a nonprofit that sponsored high school students from underrepresented communities to attend a week-long seminar on climate policy. She applied on a whim, crafting a video application explaining her struggle against environmental injustice in her own community, and by mid-February, received notice that she was awarded the fellowship. That March, she found herself standing inside a polished conference center, 2 blocks from the Capitol building, soaking in the murmur of voices, college students from across the country, advocacy group representatives, policymakers, and reporters. For the first time, she felt like her voice belonged in that world of suits and press passes. Over 7 days, she attended panels on carbon pricing, heard lobbyists debate the merits of a Green New Deal, and met with congressional staffers who described their ethical quandaries, balancing constituent demands with corporate interests, deciding when to escalate climate action to the budget reconciliation process, or when to pursue piecemeal regulation. She asked pointed questions. Why did legislators allow oil tax credits to persist, even as the science on climate change grew more dire? How could communities like hers be shielded from the economic shocks of transitioning away from fossil fuels? A senior aide from a prominent senator pulled her aside after one session and said, "Your questions are sharper than some new hires I see. You should consider coming to D.C. again, maybe for college, maybe to work. Keep in touch." That simple encouragement felt like the key to a locked door. The fellowship concluded with a tour of the Capitol's marble halls and a group photo on the steps under gray, late winter skies. Julian Carter, a young prodigy who would later become chief scientist at a biotech firm, happened to be in town for an unrelated event and spotted her in the crowd. He introduced himself, praised her intelligence, and suggested she might look into Yale's environmental science program. He handed her a small card. "Stay persistent. We need people who refuse to be silent." As he walked away, she felt her confidence swell. In that moment, she saw a glimpse of the future she might build. In late spring, acceptance letters began arriving. She opened an envelope from the University of California, Berkeley, admitted with a half-tuition scholarship. That was followed by a letter from Yale, admitted with a full scholarship, plus a stipend for research in the School of the Environment. Harvard also extended an offer with partial funding, but her heart was set on Yale. She called her parents from their small kitchen, the overhead light flickering as she spoke, telling them, "I'm going to Yale." They cried over the phone. Her mother from pride, her father from relief. At her first in-person campus visit in June, walking under the spires of Sterling Memorial Library, she felt as though she were walking into a destiny implicitly denied to her for so long. Yale's newest environmental science cohort included students from wealthy enclaves and children of diplomats. She stood beside them, acutely aware of her mismatched shoes and the threadbare backpack she'd carried halfway across the country. Yet, in that uneven moment, she also felt a flame of belonging, an understanding that her past struggles were not hindrances but the crucible that had forged her resolve. During her orientation, she sought out Dr. Hannah Reyes, a professor whose work on coastal resilience and social equity had influenced many of her essays. "Dr. Reyes," Amar introduced herself, "I know you study how sea level rise affects low-income communities here in New Haven, and I'd like to work on a similar project focused on the Bayou region." "Doctor." Reyes smiled warmly and said, We need that local insight. Come by my office in September. We'll talk about your ideas and see how we can get you started on the Coastal Adaptation Lab. With that promise, Amara felt a validation she'd never known. Her lived experiences now had scholarly value. At Yale in her freshman fall, she balanced a rigorous course load: marine biology, environmental policy, statistical analysis of ecological data, with an intense focus on building her network. She joined the Yale Climate Coalition, volunteered to help grade data for the university's carbon footprint assessment, and audited a seminar on legislative processes in environmental governance, taught by a former senator. When the class took a field trip to meet state legislators in Hartford, Connecticut, she asked about the hurdles of passing binding climate legislation. State representatives replied that local fossil fuel interests and union concerns over jobs made it nearly impossible to muster a majority. She jotted notes, her fingers trembling as she understood that the personal cost of activism was entwined with systemic inertia. Nevertheless, the same senator who led the delegation looked at her after the visit and said, "If you can help craft policy that balances justice and pragmatism, you'll make a difference." Your Southern perspective is exactly what we need in D.C. Her sophomore year, she secured a summer internship with a think tank in Washington, D.C., the Center for Progressive Climate Policy, where she drafted policy memos on green job training, clean energy tax credits, and the economic impacts of carbon border adjustments. She spent her nights drafting op-eds for The Hill, critiquing the failure of Congress to pass comprehensive climate legislation. Senior fellows at the think tank nicknamed her Senator in Training, impressed by her diligence and sharp questions. When she returned to New Haven for her junior year, she had earned enough credibility to co-author a scholarly article in a peer-reviewed journal on the social costs of climate delays, drawing from both academic data and her lived experience in Louisiana. Yale's press office ran a short piece on her work, calling her a rising star in environmental policy and mentioning her expulsion as a testament to her unyielding conviction. In the spring of her junior year, her final year before graduation, Amar applied for the Congressional Climate Fellows Program, a selective initiative placing top environment-focused graduates into congressional offices for a year of policy drafting. She had worked tirelessly on her application, including her research, her internships, her journal article, and a personal statement that wove her life's trajectory. How being expelled for standing against environmental injustice was not a setback, but the impetus for her current path, that she embodied both grassroots conviction and academic acumen. When she received notice of her acceptance, she was in her Yale dorm, surrounded by classmates studying for final exams. Her roommate burst in, shouting, "You did it!" And Amara, breathless, cried tears of exhilaration and relief. In January of 2024, she arrived in D.C. as a Congressional Climate Fellow assigned to the office of Representative Grace Whitman, a freshman congresswoman from Oregon who had won her seat on an unequivocal platform: science-based action for climate justice. On her first morning in the Sose office, a glass tower overlooking the National Mall, her supervisor introduced her to staffers who monitored hearings and drafted legislation. They handed her a stack of bills and asked her to prepare a briefing memo on the status of the 50-state Renewable Energy Standard Act. She dove into the Congressional Research Service reports, gazed at energy consumption graphs, and reached out to experts she had met through her internships. By the end of the day, she had drafted a concise one-page summary, complete with infographics, distilling how existing state mandates could be integrated into federal policy, potential economic impacts on rural communities, and projected greenhouse gas reduction outcomes. The policy director, a man with gray hair and wise eyes, leaned over and said, "This is top-tier work. We'll use this for tomorrow's markup." She felt a thrill ripple through her. This was the moment she had fought for since that muggy protest outside a refinery. Over the next few months, she attended hearings at the House Energy and Commerce Committee, took notes on the testimonies of CEOs from major utilities, experts from the Environmental Protection Agency, and activists urging for robust climate action. She sat in the galleries as Representative Whitman delivered her first speech on the House floor, advocating for a climate justice commission to ensure that frontline communities, low-income, coastal, tribal, and communities of color, had priority in job training and infrastructure funding. After the speech, Amara walked down the marble steps of the Capitol with her supervisor, and he whispered, "That was your language. You co-wrote that section." She felt her heart pound and, for just a moment, imagined herself in a haze of rejection letters from her past, now transfigured into policy that could protect her home region. When the Climate Justice Commission bill went to committee markup, Amara spent nights revising sections, reconciling amendments from both progressive and moderate legislators, balancing environmental goals with provisions for community investments. At one point, a senior staffer from the opposing party threatened to strip all language referencing environmental justice, claiming it would hamstring the economy. Amara stood quietly but firmly and argued that without specific measures to uplift vulnerable communities, climate policy would exacerbate existing inequities. She cited case studies from Louisiana, detailing how federal disaster relief had repeatedly bypassed Black communities during hurricane aftermaths. After tense negotiations, the markup incorporated a compromise, a dedicated community resilience trust fund with clear guidelines for equitable distribution. As the committee staff filed out, a congressman from Wisconsin, the ranking member on the subcommittee, patted her gently on the shoulder and said, "You've got the makings of a real policy wonk. Keep fighting." She let a small smile cross her face, knowing that every late-night revision, every critique she faced in high school had amounted to this: a policy that recognized the humanity of marginalized communities. By early summer, she had drafted sections of the Democratic climate package that addressed rural broadband expansion, critical for rolling out smart grid technology, green job apprenticeship programs targeting coal miners in Appalachian states, and funding streams for coastal restoration projects in places like Huma. Her workload was relentless, reading red line revisions at 2 a.m., responding to urgent "Dear Colleague" letters begging for clarifications, and attending countless staff briefings. But she thrived on the pace, fueled by the memory of her expulsion. The fire that had been ignited when she was just a teenager told to step back. Each time she clicked "send" on a legislative draft or watched a floor vote tally the ayes and nays, she recalled that moment of defiance and knew that she was channeling that youthful courage into tangible solutions. In mid-July, the climate package was scheduled for a full House vote. On the eve of the vote, Representative Whitman invited her to dinner in a quiet Georgetown bistro. This was the first time the entire staff, legislative assistants, communications strategists, and interns, gathered informally outside of the Capitol bubble. Over plates of pasta and green salad, Whitman raised her glass of sparkling water and said, "Tonight, I want to thank you for the soul you've poured into this legislation. Without your insights, we would have lost the equity provisions that ensure this bill isn't just about carbon numbers, but about people." The staff erupted in applause. She felt the weight of the moment settle into her chest. She thought of her parents back in Louisiana, her grandmother's sewing machine humming in the background, the cypress trees swaying above their trailer. She thought of how far she had traveled from that day of expulsion. She forced herself to sip her water slowly, willing her hands not to tremble. The next day, she arrived at the Capitol at dawn. In the cavernous chamber, as the bill was called up, she watched from the staff gallery as members debated amendments, some attempting to gut funding for community resilience, others introducing compromises to win moderate support. When it came time for the final vote, she closed her eyes briefly, imagining those wetlands where she had grown up, imagining the children who would benefit from improved infrastructure. When the tally read 217 ayes, 210 nays, she exhaled. It was a slim margin, but it meant the House had passed a historic climate package, infused with provisions she had drafted. The gallery below erupted in cheers, and staff members hugged one another. Representative Whitman approached her, eyes glistening. "We did it," she whispered. "We really did it." Amara nodded, tears brimming as she mouthed a silent prayer of gratitude. In the following months, the Senate took up the bill, and Amara was brought in as a key negotiator, traveling between offices, drafting compromise text on methane regulations that satisfied agricultural senators while maintaining environmental oversight. She negotiated with industry lobbyists from oil and gas firms, holding her ground on the need to transition worker training from fossil fuels to renewable energy sectors. At the negotiating table, when frustrated faces turned to her for reasons to trust her data, she simply recounted her own story. A girl expelled for protesting, who now stood before them offering detailed policy solutions to ensure that no community was left behind. Over cups of stale coffee in austere conference rooms, she found herself repeating one line: "Our livelihoods depend on these oil and gas revenues, but our futures depend on sustainability." She reminded them that representing future voters meant being visionary. By late fall of 2024, after months of painstaking negotiations, The bill finally passed both chambers of Congress. The White House prepared to sign it at a ceremony on the South Lawn, where President Marianne Becker stood waiting under a bright autumn sky. In the front row, her family, Simone and Marcus, flanked by their proud daughters, Elena and Marisol, watched as Amara took her place beside Representative Whitman and national and international leaders. A reporter asked her to say a few words before the signing. She stepped to the podium, her microphone transmitting her voice across television networks worldwide. She began. Growing up in Louisiana's Bayou country, I saw how environmental degradation and economic hardship can entwine to suffocate communities. When I was expelled from high school for speaking out, I thought I had been punished for daring to care. But that expulsion sparked a journey that brought me here, to the White House, where we now mark a new beginning. This legislation is not simply about reducing carbon footprints. It is about ensuring that every American, from our rural bayous to our mountain communities, has a stake in a sustainable future. Today, we sign a promise that no young person will ever again be told to step back when they fight for a livable planet. When the president's pen touched the paper, Amara felt a wave of relief and triumph crash through her. She glanced at her parents, her mother wiping a tear, her father's eyes impossibly bright, and she realized that her expulsion had been both the nadir and the crucible of her story. Without that defining moment of being silenced, she might never have found the voice and the purpose to fight on such a grand scale. Standing beneath the white marble columns of the East Wing, her hair caught in the November breeze, she felt a profound gratitude for every teacher who had doubted her, every administrator who had dismissed her protests, every classmate who had whispered smile more rather than listen. Their skepticism had forged in her a resilience, a determination to turn punishment into policy, transforming her personal indignity into a public good. In the months that followed, she returned to Yale briefly to complete her degree. The university proudly extended her a carte blanche scholarship and an honorary fellowship in recognition of her work. She gave a commencement address in the spring, telling fellow graduates that the system may try to silence us, but if we stay true to our convictions, we will find ourselves drafting laws that save lives. She then moved on to a role as senior policy director for the newly formed Office of Climate and Environmental Justice at the Department of Energy, overseeing the implementation of the very legislation she had drafted. Under her guidance, millions of dollars in grants flowed to coastal restoration projects in Louisiana, job training programs for displaced oil workers, and grants for minority-led environmental startups. Yet, through it all, she remained rooted in the lessons of her youth: the importance of curiosity, the power of protest, and the necessity of refusing to be silenced. Whenever she visited her hometown, she would drive out to the edge of the marsh and wade into shallow water, peering into a small handheld microscope she carried, examining algae, snails, and tiny tadpoles the way she did when she was 8. She would think of the water's once iridescent sheen and how far the bayou had come toward restoration. She would feel in her chest the steady heartbeat of purpose, knowing that a former expulsion had blossomed into a catalyst for change, not just for herself, but for millions, whose futures would now be defined by the climate legislation she had forged. And as she looked at her reflection in the rippling water, she whispered a promise to the child she had once been, that no voice calling for justice would ever be ignored again.